Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now, your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 16. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. Now, make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcast, because a little reminder, we do this twice a week. On Tuesdays, we recap the week that was, and on Fridays, it's the Picks Pod. Now, obviously, we've been talking a lot of football because, of course, the NFL rules. But with the NBA season underway, we also want to try something a little new. So I'm going to try to give out some NBA picks for tonight's Tuesday NBA sked. A reminder, I'm obviously recording this early Tuesday morning, so you got to make sure that you keep it locked to drf.com/sports to keep track of all the potential lineup changes and line movement throughout the day leading up to tip-off. But as long as the big stars are in play, here's some of my picks. We got the Knicks at -1.5 point favorites at home to the Sixers. I just think the MSG crowd will be rocking, and I'm not sure if this Sixers squad at this point, with all the stuff that's going on with them behind the scenes, are quite ready for that smoke. Give me Houston +11 in Dallas against the Mavs. I just think that's way too many points. I like the Lakers to lay the 4.5 points in San Antonio. The Lakers team, I think that, there's a lot of talk about them early on, but as they get more reps together, I think things will be okay. And San Antonio, I don't think has a firepower there. So I'm okay in laying the 4.5 points with the Lakers, but overall, we'll see how the picks go. And if they don't go well, hey, feel free to chirp me online on social media for sure. That's why we're here. But there's definitely no chirping going on when it comes to the DRF Sports Sunday Scoop e-newsletter that went 3-0 against the spread, with the Raiders' double-digit win over Philadelphia and the Colts and Bengals, who both scored double-digit outright victories as road underdogs. Now, that's 7 straight weeks to start the NFL season and a 16-5 record against the spread in 2021. So if you don't already, make sure you sign up for free at drf.com/sports to receive 2 free weekly newsletters delivered to your email inbox every Friday and Sunday. Both are packed with powerful betting angles that you don't want to miss. Again, drf.com/sports for all the insight and analysis you need each and every day. Plus, of course, we go in depth on this podcast. Speaking of, I gave you some NBA picks, but in terms of my NFL picks, had a solid bounce back week, and I'm okay with that, including a solid cover on Monday Night Football. And to discuss that and more, including all of the weekend's football action, Matt Russell stops by right about now. Mr. Matt Russell is back after having a pretty decent Friday pod when we were handing out winners. But before we get to the weekend's action, I gotta ask you how you survived that epic battle that was Geno versus Jameis on Monday night, a 13-10 win for the Saints. Seahawks cover 4.5. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm glad. But how did you survive that one?
Yeah, barely, I guess. We got what we asked for when it comes to Jameis and Geno, right? Not that we necessarily asked for it. I don't think anybody put that in paper and submitted that into the league office. But you know what? That was it, right? Like, people getting upset about Geno Smith, but Geno Smith's out there just Geno Smithing around, right? Like, it's not his fault that he's Geno Smith. He's taking sacks, and it's like, well, what are the alternatives? Because fumbling the ball is certainly an alternative. Throwing an interception is certainly an alternative for Geno Smith. So, like, isn't that kind of the best case scenario? Because after all, he is Geno Smith. And when he's looking across the field, watching Jameis Winston all over the field, like, of course, Geno's just going to Geno. So, like, it was all just a little, too perfect for us. We had, obviously, Seattle on the money line. That would have been nice, but that's more of a field goal kicker issue right there. But certainly we're able to cash the spread I shouldn't say very easily, but it was never outside of the spread, which is, obviously a good indicator on whether we're on the right side of a bet. Things got very scary towards the end there. The pocket collapsing with Geno in the end zone, down 3. I'm like, oh no, this is going to land exactly on 5. This is going to land on 5. And then he throws the pass across the body, and it's like slow motion. The Saints defensive back like reaching up, and he catches it, but then of course he goes to the ground, and so we were okay, and ball squirted out anyway. But yeah, man, like living that life, it wasn't as sort of raucous and insane as you'd expect maybe a Geno Smith, Jameis Winston matchup to go, but a lot of like the quarterback coming to the sideline and the coaches being like, what happened there? Like you could literally see like Sean Payton say that to Jameis on the penultimate drive. What happened there? And like, I can't imagine what Sean Payton, how he's dealing with this coming from Drew Brees, who would probably just reel off like 7 different things that happened on that like 4-second play, because that's just Drew Brees being an 18-year veteran. He's on the Manning cast, like reeling off the 5 things that happened on that play. Whereas Jameis probably just comes to the sideline and is like, yeah, I don't know, coach, my bad. And it's like, no, man, like this is a next level position, bro. We got to do a little bit more than that. And so both guys were not doing a little bit more than that when it came to the game yesterday. But you know what? That was the point, right? You always say like, garbage teams, let's take the points. And I don't know that those teams, I don't know that they're fully garbage because the bar is getting lower and lower and lower in the NFL. But, that was certainly in those iterations of those two teams. And again, part of it was there was the Bomb Hurricane or whatever it was, which, sounds like an album name. Yeah, like it is what it is, right? Like we got what we signed up for. And fortunately for that purposes, it means we actually cashed and the money all spends the same.
I'm going to make those hoodies. 2 trash teams take the points.
Yeah.
But either way, I'll take the cover. And I barely got a winning weekend, which was the goal for me after a horrible week last week. So I'll take it. Now, A weird week in the NFL is there were a lot of blowouts, but we were able to sniff out some underdog outright victories, including a 41-17 win by the Bengals over the Baltimore Ravens. And, you called it. First off, we were talking about the Bengals were ready for prime time against the Ravens. But my question here is, are the Bengals really this good in terms of prime time in the AFC? Or my question to you is, was this just a really good spot for them?
Yes, a little bit of both, but also kind of neither of both in a weird way. Like, yeah, obviously we talked about the spot, and don't sell yourself short, by the way. I mean, you guys go back and listen to the clip, right? You're talking about Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase leading into my, revelation that they were the red light special on Friday for an outright win. And yeah, like those two guys obviously lighting it up. I was really impressed with the Bengals defense, right? That's the thing that coming into the season, we weren't really sure about. And you see a lot of times a team adding a bunch of players to a pretty shoddy defense and it never really working out, because if you're on your second team in the NFL, there's usually a reason for that, right? If you are good enough, you're probably getting re-signed by that team. And so when you get a couple of extra, take 4 or 5 different guys on defense for the Bengals that have come from other teams, you're like, yeah, I don't know if that's the answer, right? And then you watch them against the Ravens, and listen, the Ravens are in their backup tackle who then got injured, so they're talking like third stringers here, and they were able to contain Lamar Jackson. So that was really impressive for me, along with obviously the offense that we know can be pretty good. So are they that good? Again, we talk about range all the time, right? And the answer is like sort of, because sometimes they can be that good, and sometimes the Ravens can be that quote unquote bad, right? And we saw them play to the top of their range against the Chargers, and then we saw them play towards the bottom of their range. And so, look at it this way, right? If the Bengals played the Chargers this week, after the Ravens punked the Chargers and the Bengals punked the Ravens, would the Bengals win by 1 billion points, right? The answer is no, of course not. This is the NFL, right? Everybody starts at 0-0, and these teams are, in this case, are all pretty much capable of playing the same. And some play a little bit worse on a week-to-week basis, and some play a little bit better. And things get a little out of hand in the second half at certain times, especially when, in this day and age, we start going for it a little bit more, and teams start realizing losing by 3 points and losing by 30 points doesn't really make a difference, right? It's still an L in the loss column. And so, the score looks a little bit worse for the Ravens, a little bit better for the Bengals. But, and we'll see this coming week here with the game that they have, the adjustment to the point spread for the Bengals in their matchup this week is quite telling as far as where we are public perception wise with the Bengals. So for me, you and I have talked about it in their past matchups. Okay, they're right around 50. Right. We talk about 50 being that like league average rating. And then we go, maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower, but they played up to like a 60s, high 60s, right, in order to be able to play that well against the Ravens. So that actually pushes their range a little bit higher. But I don't think a Zach Taylor coach team is going to bring it every single week where we can now say that, oh yeah, this team's average rating has to be in the high 60s. I've pushed them up. They're into like the high 50s, like 60 type area. I think they hop a bunch of teams sort of in my mind's eye, but like I'm not going to overdo it here. We're halfway through the season almost, and like this is finally their best performance. Like, no, I'm not getting crazy about it. We're happy to take the win and sort of read the tea leaves, if you will, there. But I think it's just, it's just the NFL, right? Like sometimes you have a really great game, and if the other team doesn't, then you can put a hurt on them pretty quick. And I think that's what happened here.
Yeah, totally. And this will be a week where every single NFL show, the lead story will be the Bengals, the Bengals, the Bengals. And you're going to see that Jamar Chase crazy, what was it, 70-yard touchdown? I might be off on how long the touchdown was. But bottom line, like he took a screen pass and took it out. You're going to see that play like 25 million times from now until Sunday's action. So all of that talk will lead to people being like, yep, Bengals are great. Bengals are great. And it'll be interesting to see how that affects the line moving forward for sure. Now, another line that we found very interesting, and you talked me into going against my Niners, which I need to happen from here and there from time to time because I want to see my guys do well. I'm a Shanahan supporter. I'm a Shanahan believer. But you did say, if I'm not mistaken, you did say you can see the Niners coming out in those first scripted plays. Things would be going good, but then once the script is out, who knows? And it finished with the Colts 30, Niners 18. The weather was crazy, but yeah, one QB to me was trying to make plays. The other QB was Jimmy G. So what did you think about that game, man?
Yeah, I mean, another one, it's not surprising we start with the two games that we had pegged, but like they were kind of the more influential games of the week, right? And yeah, like I'm right there with you, man. Like I was drinking the Kool-Aid on Shanahan, right? Like you watch them run that offense when it's clicking and you're just like, this is revolutionary. Like I just love the sort of ballet, if you will, of that offense, the coordination and the misdirection. And you saw that on the first drive, like the really good linebackers on the Colts were just flat out not sure where they were supposed to go. And you wonder like, well, you can't just do that over and over and over again. Like it sort of feels like you should, but because we know better, right? Because we now know what to expect from Shanahan and these teams, especially off of a bye week. It's like, we know the script is going to be great. And then it always kind of falls off from there. And they have to take an early lead to have any chance of winning a lot of these games. This is not a comeback team. This is not a comeback quarterback, right? And so it's like, okay, we know they're probably going to take that early lead. And then it's up to the Colts to sort of answer back. And once you saw they're, hitting 8-9 yards of carry with Jonathan Taylor, Carson Wentz, I mean, my guy's giving everybody a heart attack out there, had a little like period of time there with in 2 drives where he could have thrown 5 interceptions and then did have one, fumble, half interception. Only Carson Wentz can have the scorekeepers looking at it after the fact and go, well, we know it was a turnover. We just don't quite know which kind of a turnover, and they like have to change it from an interception to a fumble. It's like, that's the magic of Carson Wentz. But I mock Carson Wentz a little bit here. He played well. I mean, you also have again the bomb, tornado or whatever it was, wreaking havoc. So everybody kind of gets a pass for how ugly that football game was. And obviously it was kind of impressive that the total went over. A lot of people got burned on that because you see wind and rain and you think under. Not necessarily the case all the time, right? Especially when there wasn't even that many turnovers. Like, you'd think that would cause that to go over, but no. We talked about it last week, right? Like, I want Shanahan to be good. I want everybody to be good. And that's why it's infuriating that kind of nobody is good when it comes to coaching and quarterbacking and everything, right? Like, we punch holes in all of this. I'd love the refereeing to be good. Literally never is. And so, it's not that I'm a San Francisco 49ers fan, but like, I was on them to start the season as a team that it's like, okay, they're getting their guys back. But you know what? Enough of the excuses. Shannon's just not a good coach, right? Like, there are so many things that you have to do to be a good coach that, like, okay, the scripting thing is cool, but like, you need to be better at game managing. You need to be better at calling plays, managing your talent. And when I say calling plays, like, it's going to be a while before I forget that Arizona game where on third downs and fourth downs, while he's got Trey Lance and he's got the playbook to be able to run those plays, he just doesn't do it. And he has Trey Lance dropping back to pass. And it's just like, that's not what Trey Lance is here for. And so whether it's that, I mean, he's throwing the challenge flag and then they're like, yeah, you can challenge that, man, but like, there's kind of nothing to challenge here, but you already threw the flag and we'd love to get you out of here without having to make this challenge. But like, Frank Reich standing on the other sideline, he's like, if they don't make him challenge this after he threw the flag, I am going to blow my top. But he's chill. He's sort of like in there and he's like, okay, I'm just going to let this sort of play out. They're not going to screw this up. And when it just comes to Shanahan, I'm like, I can't do it anymore. And the thing is, his existence is going to create value for us, unfortunately, right? Because we are now going to have to bet against them basically all the time because they're going to get their own sort of extra point, extra half point on the market every single week because we just assume that it's going to get turned around or, we just make all of these excuses because we want Shanahan to be good. And on the flip side, like Frank Reich sits over there and he's not perfect, right? There's been times where we were wondering what the heck he's doing, right? And he took forever to install Jonathan Taylor as like the main guy on that team. So maybe like, talent management isn't exactly his best quality, but we talked about, we're like, you know what, if Carson Wentz isn't turning the ball over, then Carson Wentz can be a pretty good quarterback. It's why we kept getting sucked into the Eagles for as long as we did. And then we would watch Wentz play and he would make that turnover play all the time. Now, the problem is we watched that game in the rain and we're like, oh God, old Carson Wentz might be back. Old Carson Wentz, he might be back. Everybody like jump off the ship right now, like batten down the hatches, women and children first off the ship. And, the 49ers don't actually catch the ball when he throws it to him. And so, it's easy to say like, oh, he didn't turn the ball over, only turned the ball over once, where it's like, yeah, but he made like 4 turnover worthy plays. So again, we have to be a little bit skeptical still on Carson Wentz, right? Like there's still a lot of Carson Wentz and Carson Wentz, right? Geno's not going to change. Jameis isn't going to change. Carson Wentz is still not ready to completely change, but that's the thing. If he can, right, if he can minimize the turnovers, which in a lot of games he's going to be able to do, then we have to just look at this guy in a different light. So I'm not quite there yet. We talked about it last week. Maybe this is coming, and that's what allowed us to be able to grab some value here. Do we know the Colts are going to win by 2 touchdowns? No, right? Same way we didn't know that the Bengals were going to win by 1 billion points either, right? But like you can see some of this stuff coming if you're really looking beyond just the scoreboard.
Totally agree. And from some interesting QB play from some teams we just mentioned to some interesting QB play in a team that we might not have predicted we would be watching this. And of course, I got to be talking about the Chiefs, who fall 27-3 to the Titans. And I don't even know how we ended up here, but we went from talking about the Chiefs tax to now, like, I don't even know what's going on with the Chiefs. That was ugly. Are they like, the Chiefs tax has to be gone now, but I don't even know how to read their lines going forward.
Yeah, that's it, right? Like, is the Chiefs tax, is it just like a half point across a key number tax like it used to be? Or are we just radically just wrong on this team, right? And I, I'll take the mea culpa on this one, right? You were like, yeah, I think Tennessee, that's got to be the spot this week. And I was like, look at the defensive back situation. And like the Chiefs team that you and I know is going to go up and down on that Titans team, because these teams have played each other a fair amount in recent times, right? It's not like we're just kind of like theorizing about all of this. We saw, the Titans take a big lead against the Chiefs in the playoffs, and then the Chiefs just absolutely wail away on them, right? Like Derrick Henry existed then, the Chiefs' bad defense existed then, but somehow like the defense is even worse than it always has been. And now all of a sudden, and we talked about it, but yet I'm still like trying to make a case for the Chiefs in this game last week, but we talked about it. Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, and then what? Right? Like they're just, from a weapon standpoint, like there are plenty of really awesome quarterbacks, and obviously Patrick Mahomes is that. But when we look and we say all the talent with the Chiefs, it's like, well, there's kind of two guys. And what if those two guys are pretty banged up to the point where they don't practice during the week? We take, say, instead of Travis Kelce at 100%, Tyreek Hill at 100%, maybe those guys are at 90%. Well, those guys aren't so much better than the other guys in the league that they can be 90% and still be that much better, right? Like that's just not, they're not superheroes, right? They're not superhumans. And so once they're 90% or 85%, we've seen Tyreek Hill drop a bunch of balls, right? And it just so happens that in a lot of those cases, the ball went to the other team and gets charged as an interception for Patrick Mahomes, but he's not doing anything either that's that spectacular, right? And so once they scored 3 points against the Tennessee Titans defense, all bets are off on this team, right? Because it was always supposed to be the offense is going to be able to make everything go away that the defense is unable to do. And the defense gets absolutely trucked through the first half of that game. But if they can only score 3 points against the Titans defense, what's the defense that can't shut them down, right? This isn't like, oh, they ran into a really good defense and yada, 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 right? This is a really bad sign for the Chiefs. And, listen, we have no, Chiefs futures or, at no point did we say anything about that, right? We're riding high with the Chargers right now in that division as far as the team that we've invested in. And that's looking great. But there's still a matter of on a daily or weekly basis here trying to figure out what this Chiefs team is. And this number has dropped going into this next week from 13 down to 10. And like you're hard pressed to find anybody looking to give the 10 with the Chiefs this weekend. Now, maybe that's an overreaction and that's the type of thing that we preach here. But it's not just the one game. It's just the one game from an offensive standpoint, I suppose. But I think it's deeper than that, man. And unless maybe it's a bye week that's, necessary for Hill and Kelce to get back to full strength, if you will. But if that's what you're relying on, this team's in trouble. And they got Chris Jones back. And I thought that was going to make a difference on the defensive line and some of the changes that they made on the back end of their defense personnel wise. Thought that was going to make a difference because they only gave up 13 points to the Washington football team. Turns out that team's like openly trying not to score. I don't know what that's about. So maybe that had more to do with Washington than it did the Kansas City defense. So, I mean, honestly, the long story short is like, I don't know, like we might be 7 points off on this team instead of like 1 or 2 around a key number. And that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's really tough to watch because it kind of looks like, not to get too football deep here, like in terms of plays and trying to analyze that, but
sure.
You can tell Mahomes doesn't look comfortable in the pocket at all. And I don't blame him. I mean, the O-line has not held up for him at all. And then it turns into, it's almost like we're watching the continuation of him from the Super Bowl where he's running for his life and just trying to make the crazy play all the time. And that's why we're seeing the terrible turnovers, whether it's a fumble, whether it's a bad interception, whatever it is, he's just trying to do too much. And you kind of get it. But at this point, I don't know. I don't know where it changes. And maybe you're right. Maybe they do need the reset of bye week or something like that to figure it out. I would probably urge them to, I don't know, maybe try and get a running game back just a little bit, some semblance of a running game back, but who knows? Andy Reid hopefully will figure that out. A team that I can't figure out because I continue to fade them and It's the Packers. The Packers were 8.5-point favorites, right? They win the game 24-10. And I came on here on Friday saying every single week you see the Packers score, they win the game. It looks like they won comfortably. But if you actually pay attention to the game, you're like, wait, how did they cover? And this game might have been the personification of that. Like, I have no idea how Washington didn't cover this game.
Yeah, and we honestly, we couldn't have nailed Bengals Ravens any better in sort of a 2-minute type of a clip situation. We couldn't have nailed the Colts and San Francisco 49ers game any better in a 2-minute, clips type situation. The best thing that we might have talked about last week was this absolute voodoo job that the Green Bay Packers are doing, again, from an ATS covering the spread standpoint, right? Again, I wouldn't make the case that the Packers should have lost that game, right? I would certainly should have been closer. And I said, Washington, it was like there was a force field in front of the goal line, right? Or that their game plan was like, okay, here's what we're going to do. It's going to be a little weird, but just hang on with me here. Let's get all the way to the end zone and then not go into the end zone. Let's get, it's not like the Texans where it's like those guys can't even line up correctly, right? And it's like 1st and 15 because the left tackle for some reason wasn't on the line of scrimmage and he's pointing to himself going that was on me. And it's like, yeah, man, that was on you. Get on the line of scrimmage. And you go, that's a bad football team. That's poorly coached. Whereas Washington's like, hey, let's just move it all the way down the field here every single time. I believe they were inside the 27-yard line 6 different times and got 3 points out of it, something along those lines. It was just a complete horror show from an offensive standpoint, from a execution at the goal line, right? And of course, the poster of all of this, the poster clip, if you will, is Taylor Heineke, sliding, not knowing the rule. As soon as I saw it, I'm like, I have seen that before. I have been victimized by that before. I believe it was Andy Dalton, Cincinnati against the Chargers a few years back. There was the same kind of deal. And so, yeah, it's honestly, and Terry McLaurin's getting hit in the face with throws in the end zone. And it's were they attempting to try to stick it in his face mask? Is that what it's you can just catch it and it counts for the, requisite amount of points there, right? You can just go into the end zone and everything will be fine. It is not a floor is lava type situation. And so you just watch that game and you're infuriated. And we went through the list of the other games that have somehow worked out for Packers bettors. And again, if you're sitting there with a Packers ticket going yep, nailed it. You're in for a rude awakening, maybe not necessarily just with the Packers, but in your betting life in general, because you can't keep getting away with this stuff, or at least I don't think you can keep getting away with this. Maybe you can. It seems like that's certainly a possibility for this team. So yeah, that was the infuriating one of the week, but the best thing that we did was sort of call attention to this, where it's the number's 8.5, my number's 7. Honestly, I would make that bet again. I still believe my number was correct in the first place. This isn't saying that the Packers shouldn't have, shouldn't have won or shouldn't have the record that they have. It's more just I don't know how they're pulling this off for their bettors, but if you're sitting there and you're in Wisconsin, you're just betting away on the Packers every week, you are loving life, and honestly, more power to you. But man, it's week after week with this team.
So I want to move on and discuss something that we normally try to bring up each and every week. It's kind of your big thought for betting and handicapping from week in to week out. And what are you thinking this week?
Yeah, honestly, it's the injury adjustments, right? And so I look at, there's a handful, and listen, last week we had just an absolute melee of injuries and taking advantage of the line movement that went, a little bit further than it really necessarily should have. And the understanding that these teams have an infrastructure, we talked about it last week about they practice, right? The backup guys practice, they know the playbook. A lot of times it's just following the playbook, right? Knowing who to block, where to block, because on any given play, not necessarily all 11 guys really matter on a certain play, right? But if they do, that's going to give you a little advantage, right? Because if everybody's working towards the same direction and executing the play, has a better chance of working out. And it doesn't have to be the guy who is 5% more talented, 10% more talented to be able to execute execute some of the stuff, because a lot of the stuff is pretty basic. And we saw that last week with Case Keenum. But from a betting standpoint, right, we see the Raiders without Darren Waller and the line crashes down to like -1. And just psychologically, I got locked into Philly +3.5, Philly +3 from early on in the week. And I'm getting all kinds of closing line value, right? And it's the exact same circumstance as Cleveland, Denver, but it's 345 on Sunday when the line kind of falls as far as it goes. Mm-hmm. If you had told me from Monday that like the Raiders were going to be just 1-point favorites against the Eagles, I absolutely would have bet the Raiders, right? Like it would have been nice to know that Waller was out and like that was the sort of thing that we were signing up for. But like I wouldn't have taken the 3, even though like that would be sort of the closing line value concept, right? And so Darren Waller, right? Really big, name, if you will, like key component of that offense, doesn't play, doesn't matter. Derek Carr's like 30 for 33 at one point in that game. And you're like, oh, okay, like it's nice to have Darren Waller, but maybe he's forcing it into Darren Waller when he shouldn't be, right? Like that's an example of that. We see the Giants, right? The Giants just dismantled from an injury standpoint. We watched them get dismantled by the Rams the previous week. And now all of a sudden, Sam Darnold and Carolina on the road as 3-point favorites is a good idea, right? Like, what? Right? Like Sam Darnold doesn't even make it through the game before getting benched. And you're like, okay, why was I on I was on the Giants, but like in theory, like you'd be sitting there going like, why did I bet this Carolina team as favorites on the road? And Sam Darnold specifically, like, because the Giants were all banged up, right? We love to always say like banged up, right? And it's just a laundry list every week of like, well, these guys are, really, really injured. But honestly, unless it's the quarterback or like a very, very, very important player other than that, like a Derrick Henry type, where you're like, oh, this is everything that this team wants to do. Unless that player is out, from a 1-game sample size standpoint, there shouldn't be a change. Now, there's always going to be a change in the line, right? We see a 2-point move with Darren Waller, for gosh sakes. Like, you have to fade that. And like, that's the thing, from a big picture standpoint, like we have to be vigilant about like not getting wrapped up in our position, right? Not getting wrapped up in the Denver +3.5. Then seeing that like Case Keenum's going to start and like there's a lot of other healthy guys who are kind of back in, and you're like, well, -1, that's too much of a reaction, right? And we were able to do that on Thursday, but by the time Sunday rolled around for Philly and Las Vegas, like I wasn't ready to do it. I was like, oh, we got +3 with Philly, like we're on the money line at +140, like value. And it's like, no, like that is an overreaction. Now, maybe if they play that game again, Philly wins, or who knows what happens, right? Because it's the NFL, these things, sort of transpire. But like, we have to take a step back sometimes and realize like organizationally, right? We have given sort of credit to other organizations as being like, okay, organizationally, they're going to cover this game, even though they are not, at their full strength. But like some of these backup guys can play too. And maybe you don't want them back there, whether it's a quarterback or an offensive line. Maybe you don't want them there for 7-8 games in a row. But for one game, we talked about Dearness Johnson. Like this is his chance to shine. Like those guys are going to be really good because they're going to try really hard. And if we don't know their name, that's actually probably a better thing because we know the Geno Smiths of the world, right? We know what Geno's going to do. He's not going to all of a sudden be good in the same way that Sam Darnold wasn't going to all of a sudden be really good for Carolina. So big picture, don't get too hopped up on injury news. And if you see a line move like that, let's just judge to see whether that's really deserved,
Yeah. No, totally makes sense. And some things that didn't really make sense is we switch gears to the NCAA because that was a really, really, really wild week as well. But, things started off well for us in the midweek, right? With the midweek picks. Yeah. And then Saturday, things got hectic. I'll say that much. What was going on Saturday, man?
Well, it's funny, right? Like we try to hit 60%, right? Like that's kind of like the dream, if you will, right? Probably not going to happen. And so, well, if we make 15 plays, we're trying to win 9 games out of those 15 plays, right? And so we go 6-9 this week and you go, oh man, like that's rough. Like that's too bad. And yeah, it is, right? But how does 9 and 6 become 6-9? Well, some quick mathematics here. That means 3 games have to go awry that you really think you probably should have. And if you're watching those early games, and we had 3 of them at noon, and you're sitting there and you're going, okay, at halftime, like we're feeling pretty good about this, right? Army scores 56 points, right? We thought that they would run all over the Wake Forest defense. They absolutely do. They score 56 points as an underdog. And they are not even close to covering because Wake Forest scores 10 touchdowns and never does. Basically, every time they got the ball, they scored a touchdown. Like, mix in a field goal or something, guys, for crying out loud. It was just insane. So if you told me, like, Army's going to score 56 tomorrow, man, do you want them +3? I'd have opened up a vein. You know what I mean? Like, just take it. Take my blood at that point, right? But they don't cover. And you're like, okay, like, I feel like we had most of that game handicapped correctly. Northwestern and Michigan, right? We talked about Michigan and Michigan State playing this week, last week, as sort of part of the deal where, you know, Michigan might come out a little bit sleepy in this game. Well, sure enough, they're only up 3 points at halftime against Northwestern. We are getting 23.5 points. Just don't lose by 21 points in the second half, Northwestern, a team that prides themselves on their defense. Nope. Michigan absolutely rolls them in the second half. This is the amazing part. End of that game, Pat Fitzgerald, the coach of Northwestern, he goes for it on 4th down on like a meaningless drive, right? And it's like, oh, okay, like he's going to, maybe he knows the spread here in college, like find me the coach who doesn't know what the spread is before the game starts. Apparently we found one here in Pat Fitzgerald because they go for it on 4th down and then they just run out the clock as if he's the team who's up 25 points, right? Like no field goal attempt, nothing like that to get us under the number. No, not even a throw into the end zone. Absolutely infuriating. And then there's Texas Tech, who's up 24-10. We have them just to win. We eschew the +1. When is the +1 even going to make a difference here, folks? They're up 24-10 at halftime, 14-0 early on, and never score again against Kansas State and lose by 1 point, 25-24. And the real jerk better in me goes, you know what? Good. That coach got fired yesterday. Good, right? Because like, what are you doing? You couldn't score any points in the second half. And so you're sitting there going like, man, a 3-0 really fell apart there and turned into an 0-3 awfully quickly. And of course, the rest of the day, we end up splitting 6-6. And it really just came down to that start of the day. And, you know, whether it's Texas a couple of weeks ago, handing us just the worst beat of the year, right? It's like that early game window really sets the tone for the day. I don't know why. I don't know how it has anything to do with the rest of the day. It just kind of does. And when you're sitting there going like, we're going to go 3-0 to start here, like this is excellent, or at least 2-1. And all of a sudden a bunch of weird stuff happens in the second halves of those games. You just shrug your shoulders. And so it's sort of a combo platter of the bad beats of the week, all happening in that first section.
There are also just some other just crazy games going on, including 9 overtimes between Penn State and
Yes.
Illinois, like 9 overtimes. Like, how does that even happen? First off, and I understand that overtime is different in college than in the NFL.
Sure.
I get that, but still 9.
Yeah. I had a buddy message me and he's like, you know, I missed that game. Like, was it awful or was it awesome? And I didn't really know how to answer that question. Right. I'm just like, it was certainly like weird electric, right? Like, I don't know how that game didn't happen like on Halloween because it had some very Halloween vibes and like more than the 9 overtimes. Because listen, those two teams played to 10-10 in regulation. So once we get to overtime, you're already in field goal range. Like, you're probably going to get through those first 2 overtimes with just field goal, because like no one's scoring a touchdown, right? The actual strange part was that all of the college kickers actually made those 4 field goals. You expect one of them to just absolutely shank it. The crazy part, the electric part, was the first 5 of the 2-point conversions. So overtimes 3 through 7, no one converted. Right? Like, you know, it's like tennis. It's like if everybody's just breaking each other, is anybody breaking each other? Right? Like, just like nobody can, and they're 3 yards away. And you're just like, somebody's got to have a play in the back of the playbook here that's going to work. And they tried some, right? We had a Philly special there for Penn State where Sean Clifford drops the ball and the ball just kept hitting guys in the hands in the end zone. And it was very like Washington football style in that they're like, we came so close to scoring, but we didn't. But, you know, honestly, just like an absolutely ridiculous game. like the only way that really could have ended was Penn State getting upset, because like we couldn't come that far and have Penn State survive, right? Like that didn't feel, a kid broke the Illinois quarterback who was already like the backup quarterback. He breaks his arm on like the second overtime. And like, it was just a complete horror show from start to finish, but it was engaging. It was riveting. Yeah, I don't know if that it was outstanding or that it was horrendous. It was just like the perfect combination of both. Obviously, never comes anywhere near to going over the total, by the way, which is amazing considering a 9 overtime game of the past would absolutely fly over the total. So from a betting standpoint, don't be as worried about taking an under like we used to be, because you don't have that same threat potential in overtime. That being said, I mean, let's be honest, the game should have gone over if it goes that many overtimes. And then obviously Penn State as the massive underdog, 24-point underdogs. They lose in advance of a big game this weekend for them.
So you have Iowa State. Are they back in the mix in the Big 12?
Yeah, I mean, they're back in the mix in the Big 12, right? Like showing just enough moxie, right? Just enough that you might have, an issue if you're Oklahoma, assuming that's the rematch again in the Big 12 championship. That was obviously an interesting game from a point spread standpoint that, Oklahoma State comes in undefeated. They come in with the top 10 ranking next to their name, and Iowa State was the 7-point favorite, right? And so you go, oh, like that's an indicator here that the odds makers aren't buying into Oklahoma State. You should bet on Iowa State. And you know what? Listen, there was a lot kind of weird stuff going on there. And, we talked box score and all of that kind of thing. Maybe Iowa State should have covered that game. Maybe that game should have been a much more comfortable victory. But Iowa State ends up winning that game by just 3 points. So if you're just closing your eyes and betting just purely on rankings, which if you are, like, that's probably not the best way to do it, because the odds makers know a lot more than the, people who vote on these rankings. And obviously you have to vote an undefeated team into the top 10. I'm not slagging Oklahoma State for that. Right. But like, yeah, that was one of the more interesting games because, a lot of people were betting Iowa State. That game refused to come off of 7 to 6.5. Like we talked about, we're hoping to be able to get that number down. And fortunately it didn't go down because we would have been on a loser in that case because Iowa State did not cover, but they get the win. So they're still on track to get to the Big 12 championship.
All right. We got a couple teams though that got some scares in terms of Cincy, who we've been talking about throughout the whole entire season, but how close were they in fact to going down?
Yeah, right. Like you give teams a pass for the first half if they're not doing exactly what you expected, right? And like that was another part of the weird scene from the early games, right? And why I only had 3 bets for the early games, because a lot of times I'll have 5, 6. But when we're looking at Kansas and Oklahoma and Navy and Cincinnati and looking at 28-point spreads, 38-point spreads, I'm like, I almost laid it with both of those teams, right? Like I was almost like Oklahoma's going to pound Kansas because that's what everybody does. And if it means Spencer Rattler gets some time in the second half, like that's not good news for Kansas either. And Cincinnati is just going to hang 50 on every team. So like, why wouldn't I bet that? And then you sort of, sane up a little bit and you go, you know what, let's just stay away from these 2 games. And we're talking scoreless first half for Oklahoma, 10-10 in the first half for in the Cincinnati Navy game. And you're like, okay, I don't think either of these teams are necessarily going to lose, but like not a great sign for these teams that again are all sort of jockeying for position as we look at the 5 teams right now that have the best chance at the 4 spots in the college football playoff. Not great for either of those teams in that instance, but we did have the strange play of the year, right? We talked a month ago, about Justin Fields with the greatest fumble recovery ever against the Cincinnati Bengals. Yeah. We had the greatest, I guess it's considered a fumble, where Caleb Williams like takes the ball away from his running back who's going to, who's getting stopped for the 4th down. Yeah. And like, heads up play of the year. Like I'm sitting there going like, oh no, is that the Caleb Williams Heisman moment? Right there. Like how perfect would that be for this season where a guy, like there are so few Heisman options out there that a guy coming in halfway through the season comes in, puts up a bunch of stats, but the play everybody remembers on potentially saving the season is when he rips the ball out of another player on his team's hands and gets over the line for the first down. Like that would just summarize this Heisman Trophy race, if you will, for the season. So I don't know if that's how that ends up going. Who who knows? But it's certainly a problem there for both Cincinnati and Oklahoma this past weekend, but probably just a blip on the radar screen, knowing that they could just play a second half and beat these teams, which is exactly what they ended up doing.
So speaking of said Heisman watch, some interesting movement, future watch, and the Heisman Trophy keeps getting more and more interesting week after week.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's infuriating at the same time. But like our guy, Kenny Pickett, right? We talked about future presentation game, if you will, against Clemson. Now, again, Clemson, not what they, used to be. In Pittsburgh, we kind of thought before the season, listen, they were a 17-point underdog in the summer in this game. And obviously it got to a point where they were a 3-point favorite and they covered this game. And Pickett throws for a couple of touchdowns, right? Like they win that game. And honestly, if it wasn't for a total botch against Western Michigan earlier on this season, this team would be undefeated and they would have that sort of extra, not incentive necessarily, but a little extra street cred, if you will, right? And so now they have this path where they're going to be 10-point favorites this week against Miami, and they have this path to the ACC title game. And then we're starting to see a little Kenny Pickett momentum, right? We talked about him 40-1 just 2 weeks ago, and now in those same markets, he's 12-1, right? So he's now sort of circling the solar system that is Bryce Young and Matt Corral. Now, Bryce Young has a nice game, right? Like they rack it up against Tennessee. He's not going to be the first or last quarterback to do that against Tennessee, especially the way that they play with a high octane pace. And, the other team gets a lot of possessions. But Matt Corral is still lingering. Again, they win games, but like the numbers aren't what we expected, right? It's like he took the first month to put up a bunch of big numbers and then is riding that the rest of the way here, right? They took a loss to Alabama and then some less than stellar performances, but they're still winning games. So it's like we're still giving him credit for those big touchdown totals, big yardage totals from the first month of the season. But you look at it now and it's like 190 yards and like 2 touchdowns. And you're like, that's your Heisman? Like, that's your guy? Like, I just don't get it. And so there's going to be a point, and I think it might be this week, where they lose another game, which is going to hurt his cause and open things back up for some other guys. And again, I'm still not seeing it with Bryce Young. If you didn't do it with Mac Jones, I don't see how you can do it with Bryce Young. There are opportunities here. I still just don't quite know who those opportunities are going for. We obviously have a position on Desmond Ridder, who I would just like to see have a big statistical game. Doesn't look like he's, I don't want to say able to do it, but he just kind of doesn't need to. The run game is so good and the defense is so good for Cincinnati, right? Which gives their team a better chance of competing for the college football playoff, which is kind of the opposite of what we thought from the start of the season. And he's not going to get the same sort of love because the numbers aren't quite there. So Bijan Robinson still sitting there. He's back to 40 or 50-1. Again, like nobody's pulling away here. And if the best play that you've got is Caleb Williams grabbing a ball from another teammate, or Matt Corral consistently putting up 200-yard games with 2 touchdowns and maybe winning a few, maybe losing a few, and Bryce Young just throwing screen passes to all the talent around him, like I still think Bijan Robinson is a really viable bet here at 40 to 50-1, right? He was off last week, but they've got a handful of games here where he can put up big numbers on the ground and be that guy. Kenneth Walker plays Michigan this week, so I imagine the world is, he's going to come back to earth, let's say, against Michigan. So I think Bijan Robinson's still that really good play. If you haven't made that play, hopefully you're on Kenny Pickett because he's certainly viable at this point. And then Bijan Robinson, I think, is the guy whose price is still there, where you could hop on something here where I think this Heisman Trophy thing is still way up for grabs.
Let's stick with the midweek football. Let's talk with some NCAA picks. We got South Florida at East Carolina. East Carolina at home favored by 9. That's a lot of points. What are you thinking here, though?
That is a lot of points. And mea culpa, one of our losers last week was South Florida. And you know what? If South Florida is going to win one game every 2 years, fine. All right, we'll walk right headlong into that. And we said that they shouldn't be favored against anybody. I still don't think that they should be. That being said, right, they sort of, shut me up, if you will. But I think South Florida is going right back to being South Florida in this game. And ECU, right, what a weird scene last week for them. One of our winners that you absolutely had to wait as long as humanly possible for that game, because that game was supposed to start at 3:30 against Houston, and there was a weather delay for like the whole day. This wasn't just a passing like lightning storm. I don't even know what time this game started. I don't even know what time this game ended because I was long asleep by then. But it went to overtime. So we cashed plus 13.5 relatively easily, even if it took a long time to do so. But the point is that they were able to hang with Houston. And that's one of the better teams in the American here. I think ECU, again, this is a team that can score a ton. I think they can pull away from the South Florida team who might be really, really excited that they actually won a game. This is an opportunity here for ECU to blow a team out in prime time at home. Again, it's not necessarily like the biggest game on Thursday night by any stretch of the imagination, but -9 is good enough for me. I think ECU blows them out here. I'm taking the favorite in this one.
As we also continue another game, and if I thought the last game had a big spread, Coastal Carolina at home, -18, hosting Troy.
Yeah, and that was the one last week that you'll recall, like we did well to avoid betting on that game, right? Because we stopped our App State Fade Fest this year just in time for them to knock off Coastal Carolina. So it'll be interesting to see the response that we get from Coastal Carolina. That being said, there's also a decent chance that this team isn't as good as last year's team that had a little magic to it. Let's not kid ourselves here, right? Like that team was pulling off some of their wins and wasn't necessarily dominating everybody in the conference. And Troy is a team that's capable, I don't think, of winning this game, but I think they're certainly capable of hanging in here. My number's closer to 2 touchdowns in this game. So this isn't some like crazy, like nonsense, whatever type point spread, but I've got this thing closer to 14. It's 18. That's enough of a difference for me to take the underdog here and think that Troy could possibly hang in. Not that much different from last week when Arkansas State was up against Louisiana last week, and we thought they could hang in. I think similar kind of premise here where maybe Coastal Carolina, like Louisiana, isn't all that they're cracked up to be here. Certainly, I think a comfortable win for them, but a game that's a little bit closer than the point spread.
So let's switch to the NFL. A reminder to check out our guy, Scott Gramling, who is on fire as of late, including 5 of 6 wins in his weekly NFL 6-pack, plus the Sunday Scoop newsletters hitting at 76% so far this season. So make sure you head to drf.com/sports for all of those details and insights, and also for Scott's game previews where he goes in depth on each and every game. But as I mentioned that, we got the Packers at the Cardinals on Thursday night. And big news there as Davante Adams is out. That led to some line movement already. The Cards are still rolling. The line's up to 6. For me, I feel like I can take that number. I can lay the 6 points as long as it's under a field goal. If it swings, I'm going to hesitate. I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking. This is where I'm asking for some help, Mr. Russell.
Yeah, and like this is it, right? Like this is the big thought of the week from last week. This is what we dealt with after the podcast aired last week, when we have a big point spread move, right? And so this was lined at 3 going into last week, right? So that was sort of the presumption of these two teams. I think everybody sort of saw Washington rack up yards against Green Bay and was like, okay, this number has to come off of 3, so it goes to 3.5. Then the Davante Adams news comes out and shoots up, right? And when that number first came out, I was like, or first changed, but I saw the number change before I saw the news. And I'm like, oh man, like what happened here? And immediately I thought Aaron Rodgers, but if it's Aaron Rodgers, right, the number is going to fly right by 7 because listen, we've seen this before when Aaron Rodgers has missed time, right? Like he matters to like a 7 to 10 point difference on a point spread. You can imagine what the line would be. It'd probably be closer to 10 if Rodgers was out. And so this is a pretty clear indication, right? Like the market has decided that Davante Adams is about a 2.5 point difference maker on the spread. So you can look at it a couple of different ways, right? The market also thought the same thing about Darren Waller. And you can make the case that relatively speaking, when we think of like the usage with either guy, where Waller's getting 10, 15 targets, the same way that Davante gets 10, 15 targets, that might be sort of a fair thing on either side. But we just saw that it's not like it did anything adversely for the Raiders, right? Like they were still fine with that. And like the Packers still have a guy named Aaron Rodgers, right? Like Aaron Rodgers isn't built on the shoulders of Davante Adams, right? And listen, I'm not taking anything away from Davante Adams, but he was certainly to a degree built on the shoulders of Aaron Rodgers, because if he's traded spots career-wise with like Allen Robinson, for example, right? Allen Robinson would be headed to a first ballot Hall of Fame career in the same way that Davante Adams is headed to a first ballot Hall of Fame career. Now, here's the thing. It's not like the Packers have never played without Davante Adams before, right? That he got hurt last year against Detroit, finished the game with like 3 catches for 35 yards. So by and large, not a factor. Now, yes, it was Detroit. And of course, Green Bay ended up winning that game really comfortably. But then they went on the road against the Saints last year. Now, this is a Saints team that won that division, right? Obviously deep into the playoffs, probably a fumble cost them a spot in the Super Bowl against Tampa Bay. So not any sort of garbage slouch team. And the Packers did just fine, winning that game in New Orleans. Then they won the next week, again, comfortably covering the spread, which again, they just always do somehow, but comfortably covering the spread against the Atlanta Falcons. And so they're 3-0 essentially without Davante Adams last year, with one legitimate, matchup against the Saints on the road. So that's whether it's that Saints team or this Cardinals team. 6 right now, too many. And I don't know if this is going to go higher. It's never going to get to 7, because right now, let's be honest about it. You can't bet Arizona -6. Can't do it, right? You're too late, right? Yeah. If you grab -3, if you grab -3.5, that's, the herd running to the window on this news is doing so on -3 and -3.5. Right? They're not doing it at -6, or the line would keep moving, right? If you think you are a sharp bettor because you know that Davante Adams is out and you are making that bet on that basis, you're not. It's already baked into the line.
Yeah.
So the only thing is okay, is that fair? Is that too high or is that too low? Well, we just talked about all of these examples: Giants cluster injuries, Darren Waller, Cleveland last week, all of these examples of people and the market overreacting. I don't think that the Packers are just all of a sudden going to be bad. They're going to use Bob Tunyon a little bit more. He's a guy who got a lot more targets when Davante Adams was out last year. So if you're wondering from a fantasy football standpoint, from a prop standpoint, who is the guy who is going to sort of take some of these targets? Might be Robert Tunyon. Might be Aaron Jones out of the backfield, right? They now have more of a running game than they even did last year, right? A.J. Dillon, who I keep wanting to call Corey Dillon. A.J. Dillon is a more prominent piece to this offense, right? And whether that's because he's learned the pass protections or, this, that, or whatever, right? He's involved. So you can now move Aaron Jones. You can play both of those guys at the same time, right? You can have Dillon in the backfield, Jones in the slot. Lazard is certainly a guy who's fully capable, right? And listen, this is Aaron Rodgers, right? Like Jace Sternberger has been a prominent player in various games in our lifetime under, Aaron Rodgers, right? I forget the guy who caught the Hail Mary against Arizona, way back when in the playoffs, right? There's series of sort of faceless wide receivers who end up playing well under Aaron Rodgers, because guess what? Aaron Rodgers is really good. And so you're laying points with a team in Arizona here that, again, they're not the best team in the league. I know, people go well, they're undefeated, and they just did well enough against Houston, right? Covering that insane spread that would make you believe that they are the best team in the league. They are not, right? And so I can't get there to 6. I can make an adjustment for Davante Adams being out. I can drop the Packers. We always say the Packers, their range, right? It's super, super tight as long as Aaron Rodgers is around. I have them, basically locked in at 66, right? That's their number. I can drop them to a mid to high 50s without Davante Adams, and I still can't get to 6 points here for Arizona because I don't have Arizona rated that highly. Now, maybe Arizona is just going to keep beating me this year because they're, and it's funny because it's a matchup of two teams that are still somehow pulling off covers, even though halfway through the game, you're just, you're not sure that they may even win the game. So yeah, this to me is Packers or nothing. I mean, you can wait and see if you can get 6.5. If somehow it gets to 7, the other thing I would wait on, it's COVID-19, man, right? A little bit contagious, and we might have some other guys get ruled out here, right? The defensive coordinator is out and the wide receiver is out. It would be really sort of strange if it's just those two guys, right? A day after they played, right? Defensive coordinators literally yelling in people's faces all game long, theoretically, right? Obviously, Adams in a huddle. So you wait on this because this could get sketchier over the next couple of days. So for God's sakes, wait on this. Wait until the absolute last moment before you have to make a bet. And if everything stays the same, then yes, I'm taking Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers at +6. But again, you got to watch out because weird stuff could happen, which is a real bummer because this was shaping up to be an excellent game on a Thursday night. But again, we just can't have nice things.
Well, I got an interesting question here for you to wrap things up. And maybe this is nice things to people who listen to the pod looking for a little bit of a surprise because the World Series actually gets started on Tuesday. And we got the Braves at the Astros. Maybe not the World Series that people would have projected, but here we are. And I think it's still a pretty good matchup. But who you got in the World Series?
Yeah, this is the dark night of World Series things, right? Like it's not the one we want. It's the one we need, I guess. I don't know. The upstart Braves, right? Like going to knock off the mean garbage can hitting Astros out there. Like, are they the Batman in all of this? I guess in theory they are, even though they're missing their best Batman, but that hasn't hurt them this season without Ronald Acuna Jr. Listen, my guys over at the Score are like, it's Astros here. You're getting like a really good price. And I don't know if this is a Patrick Reed situation. The Patrick Reed situation is we don't like this person, so we don't bet on this person system, right? Where it's like, we don't want to put money on Patrick Reed. And that's why Patrick Reed has great value because he is just as good as a lot of these other golfers are. Well, we don't want the Astros, so we're not going to bet on the Astros, right? And a lot of this comes down to futures liabilities, right? So before the season, not a lot of people wanting to bet on the Astros to win the World Series. So the sports books are kind of fine with the Astros winning the World Series. Same thing with the Braves, right? They lose Acuna Jr. Not that many people are like lining up to bet on the Braves to do anything long-term. And so if there's no futures liability on either side, then you can just worry about this series more specifically. And so with that, a lot of people are going to back the Braves. They just beat the Dodgers. The Dodgers are obviously the defending champs and like this holy team that, didn't necessarily win their division, but of course won more than 100 games. And so just from a market standpoint here, I think there's some value on the Astros. Game 1 -130, series price -140. I mean, if you like the series price, why wouldn't you like game 1? And if you liked game 1, why wouldn't you like the series price? Because let's be honest, right? If you didn't like them in game 1, you wouldn't bet them to win the series and vice versa. So fundamentally here, the idea is, I think this team probably is good enough to be a -180, -200 in a lot of universes, but people don't want the Astros to win. And like this upstart Braves team, haven't been to the World Series in 20 plus years, yada, yada, yada. Right? Like everybody's remembering their childhood of like Fred McGriff and Terry Pendleton, and some of those guys, David Justice, we could go on. And just going like, oh, nice to have the Braves back, like kind of a fun team, if you will, against the team that everybody hates. But the team that everybody hates is probably a lot better. They are probably a lot better than -140 for a 7-game series here. I think this is one where you just take the decent price on the favorite. And, if you want to watch, fine. If you don't, that's probably okay too, right? It is what it is when it comes to baseball. So this season.
Well, hopefully people wanted to watch and listen to this latest episode of the podcast. And of course, if they want to get some more from you, where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, at MRUS Authentic. Everything that I write for the Score comes through there by and large. And then everything that we do here, anytime we get to chat, that obviously hits there as well. But moreover, happy to talk to people. Like I get messages all the time, people asking questions, getting hockey messages now, obviously football stuff. We're going to be basketball right around the corner, college basketball. We're going to be doing round robin money line parlays for college basketball. Is that something you might be interested in? So yeah, whether you're nodding aggressively right now. So whether it's basketball, football, hockey, like I'm there to answer DMs. The DMs are open for anybody who wants to sort of chop it up a little bit. But yeah, anything that sort of pops up goes through at MRUS Authentic on Twitter and obviously the Score as well.
Thanks a lot for stopping by, man. We'll catch up later.
Love it, man. Happy to do it anytime.
Thanks to Matt for coming onto the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander or on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And for more from this brand new project for DRF Sports, here's a reminder. Just in case you're not familiar with the letters DRF, it's been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now they're taking over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as everything you need to know in the NBA, MLB, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has data on every single game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, head-to-head records, and team stats. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and on Facebook. If you want the access to all of the raw data, go to drf.com/sports. That's where you'll get all of the usual previews. Plus, we go in depth on all the games on this podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, we're here Tuesdays and Fridays on the DRF Sports Podcast. My name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all we got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.